So you've worked in the sector of sustainability for a long, long time, right? What initially brought you into that space?
Another way to ask that question is what got you out of the space? Because the way I grew up, the way my natural interests are settled, the way what I studied, geology, so which forces you to think deep about Earth systems, it has always been my interest. There was a moment when my my career ambition took over, and then I decided it's a really, really interesting way to live your life, to be a partner and then a senior partner at McKinsey. You have the world at your fingertips. You are really part of very, very interesting problems to solve. You can do it fast because there are interesting people around you. And then it was in 2005, 2006, Katrina, the Stern Report, the warm winter, that made me decide that I'm going to dedicate all of my professional years, time, energy into what matters most, which is resource protection and climate protection. And then I've done that inside McKinsey. I've done that through a new company called Systemic. And then I've done it with the Landbanking Group and also a couple of other investment activities, but it's always paying into the same question: how do we lead a good life on this planet in the 21st century?
That's actually a very good point to continue from because sustainability is a word that has captured the way we talk about this entire issue. But it's not necessarily the best word, in my opinion, because sustainability means maintaining what's going on right now, and that's not a good idea. For example, maintaining the same level of biodiversity, I would not want that. So, what concept do you like to use?
Yeah, let's first settle on the conclusion that sustainability doesn't describe it in the way that ignites the hearts and the minds. And we've worked with it a bit. We need to recognize it describes keeping things as they are and not getting worse. And B, it implies that this is a responsibility that we have to the outside world. And the real solution is in recognizing that we are internal to nature, that the human industrial economic system felt, as long as there was infinitely elastic supply of nature, it felt like a separate system. But now that we are running out of it, we are recognizing that we are internal to nature and that the economy must be eternal to nature. And then I think different language is stronger. Something that works very good when we talk about nature, if we say people, look, nature is a critical infrastructure, and every infrastructure that you don't reinvest into crumbles. And we see that now that we have trespassed the regenerative capacity of this planet, we need to reinvest, and we need to do what otherwise you call a maintenance or an expansion investment. And we don't do that, and that's why nature capital is eroding. And people typically get that, but that's a very technical language. Which really describes that nature is the source of the benefits that we need to thrive. And that's why we have to redefine our relationship to it. There are other words like regenerative, which is nice. There are words like nature positive, which is nice. There are words like accretive systems, etc. All of those work in their respective contexts. The very important thing that's also a focus of our thinking and our work right now, we must not position it as a cost, as a down payment, as something to compensate for. We must consider it and frame it as a hellishly smart investment into future benefit. That what gets us on our toes and on the edge of our chairs as we look at the rest of the economy, where we want to take long positions on stuff that is value creating in the future. And nature is by any good standard. And so I think this is the best way to tell the story today, not sustainability, but investing into our future well-being, broadening the conception of wealth.
Yeah. Let's talk more about what actual steps we can take in a few minutes, and for now analyze more of the problem. So I presume you also think that there's a systemic issue, right? A systemic issue with our economic system, with the way that our current social contract works, and so on. What for you is that systemic issue that we're facing and that you're trying to tackle with the land banking group?
There's different ways to frame it, and every time there's something to be said of how our solution that we offer with the Landbanking Group can be helpful. I mean, the fundamental thing is that we have always looked at it as an open-ended resource, an infinitely elastic supply, to use economic language, which it isn't, which it felt it was for quite some time, but now our nature capital has degraded to breaking point, and now it's not being made available. Another way to frame it, that it is that we are getting to the limits of how to describe a private good and a public good. Public good theory worked in an empty world. It's increasingly hard to describe, to establish or maintain the concept in a full world. And yet another way to frame it is that we are not pricing the nature-related risks properly. We are currently overpricing the old stuff, and we are underpricing the new stuff. We are not pricing capital and risks associated with the old stuff high enough, and we are not pricing and we should be pricing the new stuff with a lower risk, with lower risk pricing. That we get wrong, and that's why we always create stronger incentives to do things that continue to deplete nature, and we don't provide enough capital at the right capital cost in the stuff that makes nature this wonderful source of resilient services, risk mitigation services, adaptation services, provision services. We are just we are massively underpricing, overpricing the risk of associated with putting money into nature.
Honestly, I always find it awe-inspiring that we have shifted out of this world, that nature isn't an infinite resource. A species has to get to that level first, right? It's not an easy thing to do to get to the point where nature suddenly feels like a finite supplier of actual resources. But so you've talked about pricing, current opportunity costs, the opportunities for the future of ecosystem services, and to resolve that pricing issue, you, together with your wife, have founded the Land Banking Group. In 5 sentences, what does the Land Banking Group do?
We want to bring nature on the balance sheet, and we think we found a way in which that can be done. We give every pixel of the planet an ecological passport with regard to biodiversity, carbon, water, soil. We call it a nature capital account. And with this nature capital account, you can now enter contracts between those who provide nature capital, who are the land stewards, and those who need it, which is all of us, and increasingly more so. Through that, we have contractability, a new quality of equitable, trusted contract between the providers and the users of natural capital. And the way these contracts are designed, they also qualify as a capital asset. And that is important because once you consider money put into thriving ecosystems, an asset investment, you are not looking at it anymore as a cost, as a penalty, as a discount. Then you're looking at it as holding an entitlement to future benefits. That's the moment where capitalism works again. Currently, it's destructive. The moment capital, with all its instruments, allows us to see nature as a source of future value, an asset, then our relationship to nature changes. So it's a technical answer to a philosophical problem.
Man, I really love that. So, what are 2 specific stories of impact that you've had until now? I saw some project examples in South Africa that you're partnering with someone. I saw some actual companies that have been purchasing these services like VData. Can you tell 2 of your favorite stories of people that you've been working with or companies that you've partnered with for this?
Take a chocolate brand, which happened to find out that cocoa prices have quintupled And that's not clear anymore whether they will have cocoa in the future, which is a hard story to tell to your investors if you're a chocolate brand. And the availability of cocoa beans is subject to, are there still enough shadow trees? Is there soil organic carbon? Is there water holding capacity in the ground, which tells you something whether you will have a harvest in the next drought? And the next drought is next year, as we all know. And for them, all of a sudden, it wasn't a given anymore, but that they will have these supplies. And now we measure for every one of their land stewards, their growers, we measure nature uplift, another cubic meter of soil organic carbon, another cubic meter of water holding capacity, another shadow tree, another kilogram biomass of pollinator insects, which matter a lot in cocoa. And they pay for that. And every time they get something in return, not just a proof of payment, a receipt, they get a nature equity contract, which is a legal right, an attribution right to that unit of improvement. And then they look at this and say, look, what we've done here really is not just, we didn't just pay more, we have invested into our critical infrastructure that supports the earth, that supports our value chain. And now that creates a much better conversation with their bank, because the bank says, look, this is a much more resilient asset to invest into and to provide debt capital with their rating agencies, with their insurances, with their customers, with their board. In the end, they might even have a conversation with the government that says, look, companies like you, we will support because what you do, in a way you do what we thought governments could do in the past, but in the future we know that everyone needs to have a positive incentive, so we will give you incentives to do more of it. And because every time they hold an asset in their hand that has value increasingly as it trickles through the economy. So that's what we do. And another one is, on the other, still an example where there is a direct value chain link, a construction company that thought it would be building 14 hectares of a new concrete production plant. And it finds out that this will create an industrial heat island, which in a 2 degrees world has 6 weeks, 8 weeks of temperatures in summer where you can't work. And so you have to invest massively into air conditioning and cooling. As it happens, the neighbor is 15 hectares of old-grown forest, high-grown forest, and every tree has 30 kilowatt of cooling to offer. And so now they pay the forest owner for retaining those forests, and they essentially buy the cooling as a service, and that again is recognized as an investment into the going concern of that project. Much cheaper than buying technical cooling solutions. And yet another one is way beyond the value chain. Conservation Africa, where one of Africa's largest conservation organizations went from collecting donations, which is a very thin ice, they went to selling verifiable nature units. So they use our nature capital accounts to issue verifiable nature units, which every time is 1 square kilometer of maintained nature. And whenever they deliver that, they get paid. And that seems to change the readiness to invest into this, because you're holding an attribution right in your hand, which in some which first of all means that you really have safeguards, that the nature protection is real. But secondly, also, it starts to hold value. In some countries like South Africa or in Singapore, they start giving you fiscal, so tax reduction incentives to invest into these assets. And so it's also another step out of a world where this is money drowned towards a world where this actually is perceived as holding a value, a long position of something interesting in your hands. Of course, that can't be the end of the journey. Of course, we need to move in a world where holding these positions is seen as real value in the same way as you invest into other fungible assets. For that, we need to have more capital market and policy incentives. But creating the infrastructure that allows that is the first step. Without that, we can't go the second step, and we are building the first step.
I think that is so important because about 2 years ago, we organized something called Refi Barichara, regenerative finance, basically talking about the exactly same thing, but based on the blockchain. And that's the first step we go, actually creating that asset class. But then from there on, we can go very different places. What you're describing almost seems like creating a secondary trading market, assets that can then be traded and speculated upon. How do you see the future unfolding for these asset classes? Is it something that can be traded globally, or is it a one-time purchase to compensate for damage we've done to nature, like maybe with carbon credit markets?
Look, fundamentally, I believe that nature is an aggregate, an asset, something that doesn't have one uses, that doesn't create one benefits, but it creates multiple benefits to multiple beneficiaries. And in a way that makes it different from carbon. If you think about it, carbon, and even if you trace the history of the Kyoto Protocol and CDMGI, these early versions of an offset, carbon only has value, or carbon has no intrinsic value. It only has value as a positive to a negative called a ton of carbon emitted. Only under those circumstances you want to hold a right on carbon. It's different from nature. If nature is different, is a critical infrastructure that gives you all these benefits, then you have multiple reasons. Sometimes these reasons are more related to any one of an ecosystem services, be it water, be it flood protection, be it soil health, be it provisioning with cocoa in the time of extreme weathers. But sometimes it's a more local demand, sometimes it's a global demand, sometimes, yes, it is a compensation demand, sometimes it's non-equivalency demand, sometimes it's within your value chain, sometimes beyond your value chain. So there are very different legitimate reasons why we need nature. Sometimes it's a store of value, sometimes it's just the insurance value that comes from healthy nature. And what we essentially have built is generic infrastructure that can serve all of them. We think it has one significant advantage over the way in which many of the carbon credits have been created in the past, because it's always, the asset is always constantly and immutably linked back to the underlying. So there's always a link to this nature capital account. So you always know whether your asset, this right that you bought, still holds value. That wasn't the case in carbon markets, and much of the integrity crisis started there. So that's one fundamental difference, apart from the other differences that I alluded to, which is it goes from carbon to nature, which is a broader concept. It allows for something that is being discussed very critically in the carbon markets, which is if you do carbon credits based on a Kyoto style standard, then you always need to, the only way to prove that this is as good as the ton that you emitted, or that it's the positive to the negative, then you also need to ring fence it by introducing criteria such as additionality, leakage, and permanence. And if you think about it, first of all, these are concepts that are increasingly hard to establish on a heating planet, if you really think about it. And secondly, if nature is critical infrastructure, then you don't need to prove that it would have gone down if you hadn't done something. Then you simply need to maintain it. Yeah? And the fact that you've maintained it is good enough an outcome to prove, or an attribution right to own, or that you have expanded it and improved it. So when you do normal investments into an asset, no one will ask you a question around whether this additional to something else, or whether there's a counterfactual that only creates the value, which otherwise wouldn't exist without that counterfactual. I hope I'm clear enough here. And so it's a very it's just more normal. It's organized like an asset market and less like a compensation market. That doesn't mean that we can also issue some of those nature attributes in the way that they can qualify with standards that exist in the carbon markets, but I rather have it this way around than limiting ourselves to Kyoto-style credits, which would probably only apply to a very small amount of the demand that we will see for nature in the future.
Very interesting. Yeah, I found it very interesting as well to see that you decided to go to the private sector for this, which is a lot of personal risk. I'm pretty sure you probably used a lot of your own funds or trust that you had accrued with investors to found something that, as you said, is basically building the base layer, which is not necessarily a great source of capital return in the very short term context. I'm very split on this because, as you said, the donation based projects usually don't last very long, or it's a very, very volatile source of funds. While creating these kinds of asset classes can be a lot better, but it's a lot of sunk cost until you actually create something valuable for the projects. What made you decide to go to the private sector for this instead of immediately trying to do it with the government, for example?
Well, first of all, I've spent, even if this conversation happens at a university, um, most of my life I have spent in the private sector in a private consultancy, McKinsey, and then in Systemic, which is a B Corp, but it's also a privately financed, funded company, and now again the Landbanking Group. It's driven by this mindset that we have to be more radical. We have to more daring and try things that challenge the status quo, that we must be prepared to take more risks and not just push it on the 27-year-olds or the 23-year-olds to be the risk takers and take our money home that our generation has made. We need to be part of that, and take the risk, by the way, not just the risk also. We have to do to burn the midnight fuel and to do the hard work of building something. So we can't just delegate that to the next generation. We also have to do it in my generation. I deeply believe in that. And then essentially building what we are building is a very complicated full tech stack, which requires significant investments, and you need to have private capital markets to fund something like that. I happen to think it's a good story from an impact perspective anyway, because if we get this right, then that, I mean, what to compare it with, it's almost the PayPal of nature, where everyone who has something interesting, valuable to offer in terms of nature improvement can very easily transact it with someone, and then it's almost a clear stream of nature where then these assets can be taken to value. So if you build something like that, you are linking such an important problem like nature preservation to an essentially exponentially scalable model. So that is very interesting. This could be huge. But of course, it comes with risks. And if impact risk takers, impact investors are worth their commitment, then this should be interesting to be invested into. So and so far it has worked. We have a wonderful group of mission-aligned investors. But yes, that of course, personally, that's a big risk that we are taking. The risk of looking underly ambitious in the eyes of our 6 children is much bigger.
I very, very much like that last sentence. Yeah, and thank you very much for taking the risk and putting in the midnight energy, as you said.
Yeah, be nice to us if that whole thing goes up in flames.
I'm always for who's more radical and actually trying hard, because you see so much mediocrity in the world where people pay lip service, try to do things, but just give up after a very short
And it's
time.
not the nature of the problem we are trying to solve. We can't solve it with any sum of incremental changes. We need to disrupt. We need to invent new asset classes. We need to challenge current perceptions of wealth. So, yeah, we need to become constructively impatient and correctly radical in order to solve that. And I think everyone has a part to play. Look, I've been quite privileged because how our life evolved, family-wise, business-wise, and so it would be purely unacceptable if we didn't try to put ourselves more on the line at this, given where we are in history.
I would also love to hear what your dream is for how the world might look like in 10, 15, 20 years. What are some things, economics wise, land banking group wise, whatever you want to focus on, that you would love to see in the world, that young people coming up through university like me can do and start building now?
Look, I mean, first of all, we need to understand, and I'm not um, saying that to pour water onto the parade. We need to understand that the next years will be shaky. They will be rough. They will be hard. There will be bruising, and we've seen this week. There will be more of that. I'm not saying that to reduce expectations. I'm saying that to give us so that we don't give up when we don't feel that it's all playing into our direction. So we need to understand that that there are significant factors of retardation playing against us right now. But of course, they can't hold on forever because you can't corrupt physics. And so in the end, we will have to recognize and to rebuild our economy along those lines. Those who do that are blessed because they are in the middle of the intellectually most interesting problem to solve. I mean, that's where I take all my juice from. It's such an interest, even if it wasn't about the moral imperative, if it wasn't about the threats, just intellectually, it's such an interesting problem to solve. There's how to reconcile tech and science and financial markets and the political economy and societal perceptions. It's really, really interesting, worthwhile problem. Now, and increasingly will also be a rewarded problem. So I was still part of this generation where you either went green or you did a career. And I think in the future, you can't have a career unless you're green. At least your mindset is. I think in 10 years' time, we will have discovered that I think we will be in a FOMO around being close to these good solutions because they are better energy, better mobility solutions, more livable cities, landscape restoration, biodiversity hotspots, all of them will be recognized as such an important thing that everyone wants to will try to be close to that, will try to be invested, will try to be associated with your brand, with your constituents. So I think and that's the only way to not to trick, but to positively use our human strengths. Whenever we discovered there is something of value, then we were able to build Gothic churches. Then we were able to compose symphonies. Then we were able to travel to the moon. Then we were exploring South America for gold because we thought it's valuable. And once we find out that in a heating, fuller world, these things, having good energy without the burden of emissions, having good mobility without the burden of sickening urban populations, having access to water, which ecosystems provide, that will be the hot stuff. And organizing these as markets that we can try, or as political or societal playing fields, but also as markets that we can trust, that are accessible, that are equitable, is a huge opportunity to reinvent ourselves. And I think this is going to be almost a second moment of enlightenment where we have to question all the premises that we have built into the way we do science or politics or we run our societies. And there was 200 years ago, 250 years ago, there was also a moment where nothing that we had inherited really explained the world in which we had ended up. And that's how it feels again. The old stuff doesn't play out anymore. And so we need to have a new model to run this. And we are in the middle of that, which is in a way a grace and a gift, and that we can be the ones who are able to recreate that within our generation. Again, it will be a rough ride. There are significant vested interests that don't share that vision. In the end, they will have to abide, and it's our job to make sure that this day is sooner rather than later.
Absolutely true. Sooner rather than later. Thank you very much for your pioneering work on that. It takes a lot of dedication and commitment to keep at it. So.
Foolishness. Yeah.
A little bit of naivete. Absolutely.
Yeah. But that keeps us young.
Is there anything else that you want to say? Anything that you find so exciting that you want to share with the world about Landbanking Group, about making nature an asset class?
Look, there's one point which I didn't properly answer earlier. When to think of it in asset class, of course, we always think tradability, securitizability, secondary markets, all of that. So I think currently, before we jump there, currently it would be a real advantage if we have contractability before we have tradability. That alone offers a huge opportunity to redirect funding into nature, reward land stewards, making better land use choices. So even if there was no tradability at any time at all, that already would be a big progress. Now, however, we will of course crowd in more money, particularly institutional money, and we will get more, and we have stronger price signals if we had secondary markets. I think this is a future that is thinkable and that we should also go for. There are first instruments that do that. You can just put nature attributes as a digital asset on a market and see what happens. You can create nature asset companies. At least that's something that's being attempted by the Intrinsic Exchange Group. You can take special purpose vehicles and then put them on the market or securitize them. All of this, technically, we have many answers to that. We have to agree on a couple of safeguards, which I happen to think are workable to make sure that we are not falling into the trap that we have seen with secondary trades on carbon markets. And the most important one is probably to ensure that every one of those contracts keeps rewarding the originator, which in a world of smart contracts and hashing data of the originator seems to be quite possible. So that would be, as far as I'm concerned, a very, very good way to reconcile many things at the time, making sure land stewards are rewarded, making sure it really feels like a valuable asset that you are prepared to invest into, that you can sell it, making sure that the market is easily accessible for the land stewards, making sure that there's a constant flow back into to the fringes, and not that not all the benefits are just being felt in Zurich or in London or New York. I think that's an interesting design choice which we have, because technically, and I'm not you talked about naivete, when we shouldn't be naive about technology, but we also should recognize that there's a real gift that we have been given both by the nature tech and the fintech community to create something that really could propel regenerative outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it becomes a real mess when you start abstracting value, creating secondary markets and so on, but you have to integrate it with the current financial markets in order to really get a lot of money. So I find what you're doing really very, very interesting. I am very happy to share your thoughts and work with the world because I think it's one of the most interesting mixes between the current system and an alternative system that can actually cause a transition, because that's what so many projects don't get, is that you need the transition.
That's very difficult, of course, and I mean this is how it also plays into. I mean, the last company was even had the name of being a company for systemic change, where we try to turn this into a profession. But then, of course, most of that was conceptual work, which is wonderful. But I find it harder, and that's why sort of almost the natural next step for me to take, to create something that is really systemic, but to hard code it, and to build that infrastructure that we need for that next world. And there, of course, you are constantly a challenged, but also be rewarded by, is this really consistent with is this really systemic change, but is this also workable? Very easy you get lost on the one end and the other hand. And whilst building something like Landler, like the platform, the technology that forces us sort of in real life to test ourselves, both for the practicality and for the coherence of the solution. And that's interesting. It's hard. It's easier to write an article or to create a PowerPoint page where we say, look, this is what should happen. The Landler platform keeps us super honest in terms of decision by decision, brief by brief, sprint by sprint. We always have to ask ourselves questions that always go from flight level 1 to 30 and back to flight level 1, which again is sweat, but it keeps us honest, and it's system change masterclass.